So as we mentioned earlier, we can divide all syntactical elements basically into two camps. The can stand on their own camp, which is comprised solely of independent clauses, and the can't stand on their own camp, which includes dependent clauses and various types of phrases. We now turn our attention to this latter group, the can't stand on their own club. Now, as I mentioned, primarily this is composed of dependent clauses. Dependent clauses have a subject and a predicate, same as independent clauses, but they also usually have a subordinating conjunction, an extra word that leaves them incomplete. Right? If we take our example, Pat loved cheese, totally independent and complete. But if I put a subordinating conjunction in front of it, such as after Pat loved cheese, suddenly there's a sense of mystery and incompletion about that phrase, and it no longer can stand on its own. So the first member that can't stand on their own club, obviously going to be a dependent clause. Other members of the club include various types of phrases, like the participial phrase. A participle is a verb acting like an adjective. For example, running down the street, Tracy tripped. Running, we can all agree, is an action, so it would ordinarily be a verb. But in this case, it's not acting like a verb. In this case, it is describing or modifying a noun, Tracy. So it's acting like an adjective, giving us more information about a noun. So this is a participle, and this, running down the street, is a participial phrase. To get more detail, this is a present tense particle because it's happening relatively in the present. A past participle would be run down with stress. Tracy needed a break. So there, run down is in the past tense and is a participle still modifying Tracy. So one of the phrases in our big tent of the can't stand on their own club would be participles. Another classic phrase we're going to see in this group is going to be a prepositional phrase. A preposition is a tiny word that orders the relationship between nouns. From, of, between, behind. And in English, they traditionally are formed in phrases. For example, Pat, from Ohio, loves Buckeyes. Buckeyes are candies made with peanut butter. And they're from Ohio. So here, from is a preposition that is ordering the relationship between Pat, which is a noun, and Ohio, another noun. So from Ohio, then, is what we'd call a prepositional phrase. Also, can't stand on its own. I can't say from Ohio and not make any kind of sense. Another classic dependent phrase would be a nominative appositive. That is a noun phrase that modifies another noun. For example, cheese, a wonderful invention, inspires my life. So cheese, a wonderful invention. Here, cheese is my subject, but I have another noun, invention, modifying or further describing cheese. So this phrase here, a wonderful invention, is a nominative appositive. It's a noun, invention, modifying or acting as an adjective to another noun, cheese. the other kind of member of the can't stand on its own club that I'd like to highlight would be a that clause. A that is a type of relative dependent clause. So something like the boat that Captain Hook sailed is beautiful. The boat that Captain Hook sailed is beautiful. Well, if we look here, that Captain Hook sailed is a dependent clause. I have all the elements. I have subject, Captain Hook, I have a predicate, sailed, right? But it's acting in a descriptive capacity here of this boat, right? And I can't just say that Captain Hook sailed. That would leave you asking, and what? Right, it's dependent. So, there are many more members of the can't stand on their own club, phrases and clauses that cannot stand alone and make sense. But I think that grouping is sufficient for mastery of the SAT and ACT. So basically, the members of the club can be divided into two groups. And a great illustration or metaphor of those two groups can be found when we consider America's favorite family game night choice, Jenga. Now in Jenga, we have two types of bricks. We have a brick that you take out and nothing happens. And we have a brick that you take out and everything falls apart. The brick that you take out and everything falls apart is a restrictive dependent clause or phrase. And a brick that you take out and absolutely nothing happens is what we call a non-restrictive dependent clause or phrase. So just to recap, so everybody's on the same page, amongst all those syntactical elements that can't stand on their own, which is pretty much anything that's not an independent clause, we can further subdivide that large group into restrictive dependent clauses and phrases and non-restrictive dependent clauses and phrases. The big difference between the two is that restrictive ones, there is absolutely, positively no commas used. Whereas in non-restrictive dependent clauses and phrases, we need attendant commas on either side of the phrase. So let's go in for a closer look at restrictives in particular. So to get a formal definition on here, a restrictive dependent clause or phrase is a clause or phrase whose removal would damage the meaning of the sentence or open it to greater ambiguity. What does any of that mean? A clause or phrase whose removal would damage the meaning of the sentence or open it to greater ambiguity. Ambiguity means confusion, or it's less clear what we're talking about. Well, I have a couple examples prepared here. Let's say I'm buying a house. And let's say the realtor, as I'm touring all these houses, says, the house is haunted. Now that's a big problem, because maybe on that day I've seen 10 houses. And now the realtor is saying to me, the house is haunted. Well, I need to know, of all the houses I've seen, exactly which house has a ghost in it so I can avoid it, right? So I would use a restrictive clause. I'd use a that clause, a relative pronoun clause, to, is haunted. So here we have our original phrase, the house is haunted. But I can correct that by saying the house that is on Maple Street is haunted. That restricts the houses from all the potential houses in the world down to one. And if I was to lose that phrase, a really troubling ambiguity or confusion would creep in. If there was no other context, I wouldn't know what house you're talking about, which would be a big deal if I'm going to buy a house. I don't want a house with a ghost in it. So that's why these phrases are called restrictive, because they restrict what we're talking about from all potential houses to one very specific house. Right? It narrows it down. And because it's so important, I can never ever put commas around it. Because as we'll learn, commas suggest that the information within them is not important or as important as other information in the independent clause. Let's look at another example. If someone was running towards me with fistfuls of Benjamins and a joyous grin on their face and saying to me, "A bank is giving away money," well, that's awesome. But there are a lot of banks in the world, right? There are a lot of banks just on this street. So I would need a restrictive phrase, a phrase that narrows my choices of bank from every bank in the possible down to the very specific, very, one might argue, poorly managed bank that is giving away money. And we see here, near my office, again, acts in that restrictive capacity. It narrows it. It restricts what I'm referring from all potential banks down to the very specific bank near my office. That's the one that's giving away money. So we see in these two examples how restrictive clauses are not optional, right? Because they give us critical insight into which house has a ghost in it and which bank out of all the particular banks is giving away free money. And the two examples that I'm showing here are basically using the two most common types of clauses or phrases we see that are restrictive. This is a that clause, technically a relative pronoun clause. And this here is a prepositional phrase. Now, there are cases where prepositional phrases are not, in fact, restrictive. But the majority of the time on the SAT and ACT, prepositional phrases from, of, right, beneath, below, beside, into, among, they're going to be restrictive and don't have commas around them. So what are the two big types of restrictive clauses that we see with regularity? Well, one are going to be that clauses, relative pronoun phrases. Never put commas around those because they limit things in a profoundly important way. And two, we see prepositional phrases. And again, you can look up and see that there are occasional prepositional phrases, especially when I have more than one, compounded prepositional phrases that will take a comma. But 90% of the time, when you see a prepositional phrase on the SAT or ACT, and I'll even move that up to 95% of the time, the vast, vast majority of the time, prepositional phrases are restrictive, meaning the information in them is so important that we don't bracket them with commas. So, those are restrictive clauses. Now we can shift our attention to non-restrictive clauses. And non-restrictive clause, oh, we lost our square there. We got to have our square back. Boop, boop, boop. Oh, different color. Got to keep these colors right. Non-restrictive clauses, or phrases, because I'm grouping them together for the purposes of this lecture. A non-restrictive clause or phrase is a clause or phrase doubt or confusion in the same way that the removal of a restrictive clause would introduce unnecessary or unwanted confusion. Okay, so here are my restrictives, just as a reminder, right? If I took that as on Maple Street out, boy, I'd have a real problem because I don't know which one of these houses has a ghost. Or if I take near my office out, that prepositional phrase, oof, now I don't know where to get my free money, right? But in a non-restrictive dependent clause or phrase, a clause or phrase that can't stand on its own, the information within it is not essential. It does not restrict meaning quite so profoundly. So it needs a comma on either side of it. Okay. A little info about commas. So already we're beginning to understand that far from being a subjective expression of where you might want to put a breath, commas actually signal to us a hierarchy of ideas, an emphasis on what is important or slightly less important. Because basically, what these attendant commas do, this pair of commas here, sometimes called a comma sandwich, is they say, whatever's in there, it's nice, right? It's fun. It's a bonus material, right? It's an Easter egg, but it's not essential. It's non-essential information. It's related, it's relevant, but it is not essential. And you can take it out, and the sentence makes the same kind of sense. And I'm not plunged into confusion in the way I would be if I lose my restrictive, right? The tower, the Jenga tower, still holds. And just like in the restrictive dependent clauses and phrases, we have typical examples. That would be the that clause and the prepositional phrase. For their non-restrictives, we also have typical examples. And let's see here. Let's see if I can pull up a page. Yep. So the three typical examples that I've already mentioned would be participial phrases, the second one would be nominative appositives, and the third one that we see a lot, I'll just call an intro clause. So, as I defined briefly at the top of this discussion, a participle is when I have a verb or verb form acting in a descriptive way, in an adjectival way, modifying a noun. So, like running, skipping, hopping. The girl greeted her mother. That would be a present tense participle. We also have past tense participles. Crushed by the defeat, the boxer slunk back to his locker room, right? That would be a past tense participle. But by and large, on the SAT and ACT, these are almost always going to be non-restrictive, meaning they're always going to have commas on either side of them, okay? Because I could take them out without damaging the meaning of the sentence or introducing unnecessary ambiguity. So I could say, Pat, comma, eating ridiculous amounts of cheese needs a new hobby. So Pat, eating ridiculous amounts of cheese, needs a new hobby. So that is a participial phrase, right? Eating ridiculous amounts of cheese is a participial phrase because eating is a verb, but in this case it's acting as an adjective. Tell me which Pat. Of all the Pats, which Pat is it? Well, it's the Pat eating ridiculous amounts of cheese. Materials, extra credit, surplus kind of capacity. Because I could take out eating ridiculous amounts of cheese and I have Pat needs a new hobby. I haven't introduced any ambiguity. It's not like, oh, which Pat? Like, Pat clearly identifies the subject in itself. So because it's non-essential, because it's non-restrictive, right? It doesn't provide that crucial or key info. I need to put those attendant commas on either side of it because those commas are signaling to us as readers like, hey man, this is fun, this is cool. You know, what a nice detail. That's a great image. But we don't need it. We could, if we had to, take it out. And the sentence would be fine. Okay, so oftentimes in the SAT and ACT, participial phrases are going to be non-restrictive. Are there cases where participial phrases are restrictive? Yes, but they're by and large not tested on the SAT or ACT. Okay, the second most common type of phrase that we see with commas on either side of it, meaning in a non-restrictive capacity, is going to be something called a nominative appositive. So let's just first define what nominative means. Nominative is just a fancy Latinate word for noun, so of or relating to a noun. And appositive is another Latinate word. So posit is from the Latin verb meaning to place, and ap means next to. Think about it like opposite, right? It means placed in front of. Right? Apposite means placed next to. So if we put that all together, a nominative appositive is a noun placed next to another noun, usually in a descriptive capacity. So let's see. The dodo an extinct species was ridiculous looking. So the dodo, an extinct species, was ridiculous looking. So if I'm looking here, this is my nominative appositive. What is species? Well, species is a noun. What is dodo? Well, dodo is also a noun. So I have this other noun modifying this noun. So that is a noun next to another noun. That's a nominative appositive. But notice I can take out an extinct species. I'm not confused. Like the dodo, I suddenly don't think like there's dodos running around Los Angeles, right? Dodo's still dead. Dodo's still extinct, right? The dodo was ridiculous looking. Still true, right? So losing that phrase doesn't suddenly plunge me into confusion. Therefore, I need to mark that it is non-essential by putting these attendant commas on either side of it. Again, demonstrating that commas, far from being subjective markers of where we put breaths, actually are communicating to the reader and listener meaning and emphasis. Finally, introductory clauses. Right? All those clauses starting with a subordinating conjunction are after, while, when, during, right? Those are inherently non-restrictive. I can usually drop them and everything is fine. And so they almost always have a comma following them. Something like, when it rains, I like to whistle. Or after dinner, let's hike. Okay. I'm suddenly, no one is confused about who I am if I lose when it rains. Similarly, no one is confused about the order, or fancy term, hortatory command, let's hike, if I lose after dinner. Right? It's extra information, it's bonus, it's relevant, it's helpful, but it doesn't disfigure the meaning or plunge the listener or reader into confusion if I lose it. Therefore, I need to make sure that it always ends in a comma to signal, right, the transition into the independent clause and that it's of less importance. Okay. So, to recap, in the can't stand on their own club, we have dependent clauses and a variety of phrases, participial, prepositional, nominative, appositive. And we can divide that group into restrictive clauses and phrases and non-restrictive clauses and phrases. Restrictive clauses, because of their importance in keeping confusion at bay, right, in making sure we're really clear about which house and which bank and which person, we never have any commas. And non-restrictive clauses, because the information within those commas is bonus material, essentially, we always put commas on either side. Because commas communicate value, they communicate a hierarchy of meaning and emphasis. They're not just wallpaper. They have a purpose. All right, awesome. Now we can move on and talk about parts of speech.